Good morning and welcome to Rising. The show of shows is here, so buckle up, buckle in. Briahna, what's going on?
Well, today, Robby, we have expert economists from both sides of the political spectrum to debate whether or not the Inflation Reduction Act will, in fact, do much for inflation. And later, Helber joins us to discuss the updates on the Gaza airstrikes.
But right now, let's return to the Mar-a-Lago saga. According to CNN, former President Trump is weighing whether or not to release the surveillance tapes from his Florida residence that would reveal the faces and identities of the FBI agents who searched the premises. Now, according to Trump and his attorneys, the FBI asked them to turn off the cameras before the search, but they left them on instead.
And today, a Florida judge will decide whether or not to make public the affidavit used to justify the FBI's raid of Mar-a-Lago. Attorney General Merrick Garland has said releasing the document would greatly jeopardize the DOJ's investigation.
Okay, so first on the cameras, point Trump. Like, if the FBI, if law enforcement, anybody says, yeah, can you turn off the cameras? No, do not do that. Leave them on. We saw for Uvalde, for instance, so many police, law enforcement incidents that take place. Yes, we want to be able to see that footage. We do not let these things happen in private, if only to forestall or prevent, the kind of talk that what if they planted evidence? Well, if we have surveillance footage, we can dispel that. Okay. Now, that might be different than, and probably what you're going to say is, does that mean it should all be released wholesale to the American public to identify the FBI agents? Perhaps not. That can be discussed. But I heartily agree with the decision not to turn off the cameras.
Yeah, but this is the key question, right? The idea of keeping some record of what happened in case you need to hold someone accountable down the line is a very different thing than trying to identify and dox, if you will, FBI agents right after we've already just had this incident of Trump supporters, Trump sympathetic people going to an FBI agent's house. To cause them harm, physical harm.
But I don't know if it's, we were doing that with the Uvalde police, right? We were identifying which ones were...
Well, I don't know, but I'm sure some people were trying to identify who they were interpersonally, but that, I feel like that was a little bit more of a public accountability issue than
this could become a public accountability
depending on what's
issue.
On the tapes, right? If the tapes reveal that they are, just randomly stealing Trump's golden toilet or what have you, asset forfeiture issues are big, as we talked about yesterday on My Radar, then I could see something along those lines, but this does feel punitive, and the way he's framing it is punitive, and maybe he would be better off saying this is a public safety issue or a public accountability issue because I see X, Y, and Z in the tapes. But, he obviously has the right to do what he's going to do, but in the context of what's recently happened with his own supporters and FBI agents, I hope he's ready to take the heat for whatever ends up potentially happening after these people are identified.
Well, but that's on the whatever nutcases attack FBI field offices those don't do any of that. That's irresponsible. But look, if he's a citizen. As a citizen, if law enforcement comes to your house, wants to enter, yes, get that stuff on video. That's something a leftist would tell you. That's something any civil libertarian would tell you. You want the body cam footage. You want the cell phones out recording it. You want all of that stuff.
But we were talking a little bit ago about public sympathies around this issue. Yeah. So what he is permitted to do legally is a little bit different from what he's what is acceptable morally, and whether or not it's going to tip the balance one way or the other in terms of the public perception of how he's behaved. So in a lot of ways, Trump is occupying a kind of victim status in all of this. It's a witch hunt. They're coming to get me. There's nothing really here. They're treating me differently than they treated Hillary Clinton. Okay, if he starts going on the offensive and putting a target, as it were, on the backs of FBI agents, is the public perception going to shift? I don't know. I think that's just a calculation he has to make internally, regardless of whether or not he is kind of legally prohibited from doing something like that, or legally culpable for doing something like that.
He should, in consultation with people with better judgment, think through the ramifications of just wholesale releasing that footage. But I don't think it's wrong to have collected that footage in the first place.
Fair enough.
And in fact, there's a world where it helps convince his supporters that there's no fake evidence planted, assuming that there was no fake evidence.
And to the Uvalde example, by the way, if you're making that assessment about how the public is going to perceive this, I think when you're stacking up the reality of 19 dead children against the potential harm that's going to come to the cops who didn't step in to protect them, that public calculus is overwhelmingly in your favor. We want to know who did the bad thing that let all these children die. In this match up with Donald Trump, where we're talking about an investigation that may or may not be warranted, and people who may or may not be doing their jobs, and the backlash may or may not be really grievous to the individuals involved, that's a very different calculus.
All right, well, according to Newsweek, the raid on Mar-a-Lago was specifically intended to recover Trump's personal stash of hidden documents that he has collected since the early days of his administration, including documents pertaining actually to Russiagate. And my understanding at this point is that they asked nicely for the documents back many times, and he didn't comply, and so they went and did this. Are they... It doesn't. There's not been any indication so far that the documents are actually so important that he can actually launch nuclear weapons based on having the code. That has been overstated by the media, not by anyone in law enforcement. In fact, the FBI, law enforcement, Merrick Garland, no one has made any claims that these are particularly important documents.
Thirsty, hopeful Democrats saying, "Is there nuclear codes in there? Are there nuclear codes?"
Exactly.
Yeah, and even if there were, that's the catch-22. All of this. The more important the information allegedly is that he has, the more negligent the FBI seems for allowing him to keep it for as long as he did.
Right.
Right. So if there were nuclear codes people thought were in his possession, one would presume that they change, that there's a rotating change on these codes regardless, and that it would be negligent on the behalf of Trump and look bad optically for Trump, but wouldn't actually have put national security at jeopardy. So it's that catch-22. Either it was really, really important and everyone's kind of on the hook for letting it go on this long, or it wasn't that big a deal and they have taken this unprecedented action for not.
For what is still in the category of what I've described as procedural crimes. Still crimes, still against the law, against laws that Donald Trump signed himself or made stronger based on, his own desire to persecute his enemies, but still not a kind of crime that law enforcement can always get you on because there's so many of these kinds of procedural crimes, which is not to say that Donald Trump should be able to get away with it where no one else can. I find it weird the idea that the president should be under should have a freer hand than your average citizen who could easily get entrapped in these kinds of circumstances. So I do get that. On the other hand, it does not actually seem sort of warranted by any legitimate national security purpose or anything so far, based on what we know, and that could change. But this doesn't seem to be the crisis necessitating this kind of action. And I have to think that the FBI has not, they were so naive about doing this because they said, okay, well, we'll do it when he's not there. It'll hardly even be a big deal. Will anyone even care? Like that was their thing. That is so naive to think that that does.
Trump foghorn wasn't going to go off.
Right, that colors kind of all of their judgment. So they thought this was important, but they also thought no one would care. It's very.
Yeah, I mean, look, there at a certain point, if you think it's warranted, to do the search, then there's no kind of containing this. If you got to do it, you got to do it. You try to do it as unobtrusively as possible. You can imagine a world where they did it while Trump was home and Barron was on the Xbox and there was a whole added part to this dialogue that's, I can't believe you intruded on my family and the privacy of my wife when she was in the back. You can imagine it being worse, more inflammatory than the way they handled it. All they can do is kind of minimize and contain. And, I think that they probably did as best that they could. The fundamental issue is going to be, when it comes down to in public opinion, it's going to be whether or not whatever they find or thought they were going to find justified this kind of moment.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you make of that last point there about looking for Russiagate-related documents. Does this feel to you a little bit like there's always got to be a Russiagate angle for every story?
Although I honestly, that might be wishful or hopeful thinking on the Republican side. I think a lot of conservative pundits, I'm not among them at all, are trying to spin this as, this is good for Trump because this is making him more sympathetic or something, or more back in the news, which is good for him. Okay, look, maybe it's good for him. It's clearly not good for the GOP. If you look at now what we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, I was talking about it using expletives because it's so frustrating. But what was looking like a Republican blowing out the Democrats in November is now looking a lot worse. I think they'll still take the House because it'd have to be a calamity for Republicans not to take the House back. But the Senate is looking pretty lost for a variety of reasons, for having candidates that are just too much in the Trump mold in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, etc. Candidates who are more Trumpy than Trump, who are very, very in that MAGA mode. And I get that a lot of conservatives love Trump, Republicans love Trump broadly, but there's not enough of the pro-Trump contingent to win elections. We saw that last time. What you need is to attract independent, moderate voters, former Democrats who are tired of Democratic policies and are frustrated with a lot of Democratic things. And we know there are voters out there like that. Youngkin showed that model. Yeah. But instead of courting those people, the GOP is putting Trump center stage again, and that's just a losing formula. I don't know how many more times it has to be demonstrated to be a losing formula.
Well, Robby, Youngkin showed that model, but Youngkin also really leaned into a lot of the discourse around masking and what was being taught in schools, and you can say that that's legitimate. I'm not really trying to dispute that right now, but that is kind of a character of more cultural attack that people, at least, Democrats and leftists would maybe characterize as more Trumpian. So I would love to get a little bit more granular about what we mean by Trump versus not Trump, because if you look at a candidate like Dr. Oz, I would argue his issue is not that he's Trumpian insofar as he's like a television personality and that he's a famous person, but that he lacks substance, that he's not from the States. That
Dr. Oz is just a terrible candidate.
Right, so that's the thing. I'd like to disaggregate that a little bit, because the mantra on the left is that, Republicans, I'm kind of jealous of the fact that no matter what, their people fall in line, and as long as they make it through, whoever makes it through the primary is going to get the Republican votes in the general election. Whereas on the left, there's this feeling that there's too much quote-unquote purity, and that leftists will defect and vote for the Green Party and all these other kinds of things. So it does seem to me that, to the extent that Republicans aren't lining up behind certain of these candidates, or might not line up behind a Dr. Oz style figure, despite pushing the more Trumpian figure like a Carrie Lake through in the primary election context, it might be because of some of these other intangibles where people just aren't showing up in some of these races.
I think it's that Republicans need all the Republicans to vote for the Republican, and then they also need a couple Democratic moms who are really mad at their school board, or a small business owner or something who's really mad about code. They need enough of those people, or somebody who went down a critical race theory Twitter thread or something. And all the Republicans and those people, it's a win. And it can be a big win. That's a large contingent of people. Sure. But those people in the second category, the mom who's mad at her school board, et cetera, they can be scared away from the GOP by, I think, some of the Dobbs stuff, and by they don't like Trump himself. Trump himself is not popular with these people.
Do you think that's true of like a DeSantis-style character?
I think.
Because he's very Trumpian, he hits all of those cultural points, but people are framing him like he is attractive to the more moderate voter, that he is the Trump light, that's the perfect mix of all of the things.
I think we'll have to see. He's not the election stuff he's largely stayed away from without offending Trump in any way. The election stuff's a big, that is toxic, clearly, to the kind of voters the GOP needs to court. And that's a big part of it. And just kind of the weird stuff. I don't know. DeSantis has not, I think, has not committed him. He hasn't offended Trump voters at all yet, which is smart. But he might still be attractive enough to independent voters. I'm honestly not sure yet. But I know that Youngkin clearly was. In Arizona, they could have had their sitting governor, Doug Ducey, who's you would not classify him as a moderate, but is temperamentally moderate and is not MAG on election stuff and all those things. He could have been, I think, a very compelling general election candidate. Said they have Blake Masters, who began his first campaign ad with, "I believe Donald Trump won the last election." Why? It's stupid. It's really stupid.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Briahna. I have a feeling I'm going to disagree with it. We're going to get into it.
It's always a pleasure.
Stay tuned.